Boom, what up today? We're going to talk about some of our favorite things, which are the value of DPS and progression rating, spending time efficiently, and spreadsheets. Now, I say spreadsheet, this is like a Google Doc really. There's no real advanced formulas here, but it looks cool as a spreadsheet. So, what are we talking about? The question for the day. You re-cleared all the way through Smolderon. You're on Tindril. You're something like 42 item level. You did 4 keys earlier in the week, mostly because you had nothing better to do, and you needed some aspects crest before raid. Should you do 4 more keys to get the 3rd Mythic Plus slot in your vault? That's a good question. Initially, earlier this week, I thought, it's probably not worth it. I thought about it a little more. I thought I might want to write down sort of the assumptions I was making and put some numbers to things. Because I think a theme here is that I believe talking about your beliefs at a fixed point in time is useful because it forces you to state what you believe clearly, and it gives like a benchmark in time for you to go back and say, at this point in time, I believed exactly this thing. And here were the arguments I made. Here's how maybe my thinking has evolved. Here's why I was correct or wasn't correct at the time. All that's interesting. Similarly, if I say I believe this thing and I'm forced to write down a model of the world or some numbers that express that belief, I might write down the numbers and see like, oh, this number that I thought was worth, had a value of 100. I thought about it a little harder, and that number is actually worth 10. Whatever units you want here, but this number is 10x bigger or smaller than I thought it was, and so my belief should actually change accordingly. Like maybe I'm actually totally fucking wrong about this thing because I just didn't have the right numbers until I was forced to really write them down and work through them a little more rigorously. I'm not saying we're doing any sort of scientific stuff here, but it's certainly a little more rigorous than just saying like I'm going to do all 8 of my keys every week because that's what I do. So let's talk about the sort of modeling process here that we're using. Again, modeling, let's use that word pretty liberally. It's or loosely rather. Modeling it's a stretch for what's going on here. What I did is I ran a droptimizer of my character. This was a 43 Mythic Plus droptimizer because that's sort of the item level out of the vault, and I don't have sort of excess aspects crest to use on these items. I think almost anything I get out of the vault is going to be a low priority upgrade for me, and I already have other things I would upgrade before them. So I just really only care about like how valuable is the item itself immediately without upgrades. What I did is for each key, I wrote down the total value I could get from that key in raw DPS. This is not the expected value number in Raidbot's Droptimizer. This is the total DPS value. So if there's 3 items that are each worth 500 DPS, then I say that dungeon is worth 1500 DPS total. And then I divide by the total number of items in the dungeon loot pool. This is 51, and so this gives an average of 88 DPS for the item itself in a Mythic Plus box. And this isn't exactly right because we know that the vault slots have some tier items in the pool, but I think this means that we're overstating our case, or we're overstating our opponent's case. If our opponent is saying you should do 8 keys every week, and we think maybe that's not right, we're overestimating how valuable a Mythic Plus vault is because for me, I already have Mythic Track tier in most of my slots, and so most of the time these tier items are actually diluting the pool of possible items, and they're not additive. In reality, the real average value of a slot is worth a little less than 88 DPS. I think. It's possible there's some other assumption here that maybe makes that wrong, but to first order, I think it's less valuable because tier exists. Then I said, there's some items that aren't actually upgrades by raw Droptimizer, but they are upgrades if they came with a socket. And Google, from some ancient Reddit post back in Legion, says that a socket is worth, or is a 10% chance to happen on every drop. And I said, there's sort of 10 socketable items that I would use if they had a socket. I gained something like 1000 DPS, but these items have worse secondary stat distributions than the things I'm currently wearing. So I'm losing something like 300 DPS, which was a random eyeballed fudge factor, because I didn't want to go through and add all of them up individually. But it's 300 DPS fudge factor saying you're wearing a slightly worse item, but it has a socket. So on net, you're getting 700 DPS on 10 out of 51 items, the 10% of the time that they show up with a socket. So this is worth something like 13 DPS on average in the vault. Then I said, look, there are some items that are not good on their own, They're maybe not good with a socket, but they're valuable because they give you crests. Or they give you a 43 item that frees up crests for you to upgrade 476 items in those slots. I said these are each worth like 500 DPS, and there's 8 items that I would use, so it's worth like 155 DPS. I think this was pretty interesting to me because if we look, like, the actual item itself is worth maybe 88 DPS, the socket's worth 13, but the crests are worth 150. So like the majority of the value of my vault is actually coming from free crest upgrades and not the items themselves. Like I care less about what shows up in my vault than the actual item. So some of this is like 260 DPS or so. And this is saying the expected value of a single box, not counting anything else. Because we're sort of not taking into account any of the other items you're seeing. You're just saying, like, if I did 1 key this week and I got 1 box and no raid boxes, how much is that worth? So in order to answer that second quantity of, like, how much is the additional box worth, going from 4 boxes to or 4 keys to 8 keys and unlocking a third box, how much is that worth? Well, we kind of need to know the odds that a given great box slot has a valuable item in it. Now, here we're going to take a little liberty with the assumptions, and we're going to say that a vault box is sort of worth taking with probability equal to the total possible upgrades divided by the total number of items. So it's sort of the same math that we're doing here with the, like, average DPS, and we're saying, like, this gives us a probability for how likely it is a box is going to be something we want to take. And we're going to take this, like, last additional box only if we don't have something worth taking from any of our previous boxes. So sort of like right now, at the current state of the world, we have 5 slots open, 3 from raid and 2 from keys. And if we do the 6th, we're only going to take an item from the 6th box if none of the other 5 have something good in them. So, like, we need to estimate the probability that all 5 of those don't have a valuable item, which is going to be like 1 minus the probability that they have a good item, all multiplied together. In other words, this is going to be this quantity, this multiplication. It's about 16%. Now, I say we're taking a little liberty with our assumptions here because you care maybe a little bit about marginal upgrades from one box to another. If I get an upgrade from one raid slot that's worth like 200 DPS, but my 3rd Mythic Plus slot has an upgrade that's worth 400 DPS, then in reality, that Mythic Plus box was valuable. It was like, it's giving me a real upgrade, even though this sort of model of the world says that it's not giving me an upgrade. Now, I think because the variation in item quality is pretty small, like most things are worth a couple of 100 DPS between each other, then this effect isn't very large. Like, certainly it can't be worth more than the box itself, because we're talking about like the marginal upgrade of from one upgrade to another, or like the marginal gain from one upgrade to another, not the like marginal upgrade from a box to no box. But you can imagine a world where like your character has a bunch of 10 DPS upgrades, and then some extremely good, very rare, super high item level trinket that's like 10,000 DPS. And then in this case, even though it might be likely that you see an upgrade from the box, the overwhelmingly likely probability or case is that you see one of the 10 DPS upgrades, and you don't really care about those. The thing you'd want to do in this case is say, like, each box is actually just a roll at this like 10,000 DPS item, and everything else doesn't matter. And that's the thing that we're going to use to estimate the likelihood that we get an upgrade. But luckily here, most things are sort of similar in value. They're all just like roughly fungible off pieces. So I don't think this assumption is too costly in terms of the error on our final estimate. So there's some other things to consider. You could roll avoidance or leech. I think this Reddit post I saw said that a tertiary is like 10% of the time. There's 4 tertiaries. Maybe you assume it's 5% to hit avoidance or leech. For my character, I think leech is like a couple thousand HPS and avoidance is a couple thousand HP, which are actually pretty sizable. I didn't even think that they would be this big, but like an avoidance roll makes your character multiple percents tankier, which is kind of surprising to me. Now I think there are some DPS downgrades that I would use even with a tertiary. So the like likelihood that an item is an upgrade is a little higher. Instead of it being like 11 out of 51, or sorry, 19 out of 51, it's maybe it's more like half out of the items. I think I said 20%. This assumption is maybe wrong because previously I was going from 20% to half, and I thought about it a little more. And actually, it's like 40% for me to see an upgrade. So I don't know, maybe like 60 or 70% of the items are usable with a tertiary. I would have to look at the full loot pool, and I don't really want to take that time. But working with these numbers, maybe the probability that no other tertiary slot has, or no other slot in my vault has a tertiary, is something like 88%. If you think you're sort of 0.5 times 5% to hit one, like half the time an item is usable if it would have a tertiary, and 5% of that time it actually has a good tertiary. So 2.5% of the time you get a usable item with a tertiary in another slot, and 0.975 to the 5 is something like 88%. So that's saying like 12% of the time you see something valuable with a tertiary, 80% of the time you don't see another tertiary item in any of your other slots. And this sixth box slot that we actually care about has is like in play. It could be valuable, because obviously, like if we see two items with tertiaries, like we don't gain anything from seeing that second one. We only need to see at least one. Cool. So all that means that your marginal gain, not your like expected gain, but your marginal gain on that sixth box slot is something like 35 HPS of leech and like 50 HP in avoidance. So it's a lot smaller than like the actual raw value gain, just because the odds are so low. Like you're only 5% to hit, and some of the time that you hit, you're also seeing another item with a tertiary, so it's a lot less valuable than it initially appears. Again, there's some like quibbles here where if you have two items with tertiaries, one of them might be better than the other, and you should assign some value to the like marginal value of two tertiary items and getting to see more options, but these are like really, really small third order effects or something. Tertiary is already probably a second order effect on top of the damage, and we're pretty deep in the weeds at that point. Another thing, stamina. I think my average stamina gain, looking at the item levels, is worth something like 3,000 HP on a box that actually hits. So your marginal stam gained should be something like 19 over 51, which is 178 HP. Math was a little off there from old numbers, but maybe I'm getting 200 HP or something from upgrades in the vault on average. On the margin. What are some other considerations? Well, if I see tier gloves in the vault, this gives me, personally, in my unique situation, something to catalyze in the next catalyst slot. So on this reset, we're going to get a catalyst slot. I already have something planned there that I think is really valuable and probably won't be replaced by anything I see in the vault. But I could see something even more valuable. What am I trying to say? I have something valuable this week for this upcoming catalyst charge, but I don't have something for 2 weeks from now. I don't have another good myth track item to catalyze. And if I see tier gloves, that would let me catalyze some, or it would let me save a catalyst charge 2 weeks from now that I would otherwise have to use on myth track pants that have bad stats. Like, this is all super second order, but roughly the situation is seeing tier gloves gives me a little bit more value from the next catalyst charge, but I think that's so far in the future and is sort of contingent on me not seeing any other valuable catalyzable items or something in the next 2 weeks, and so it is not worth talking about. Another assumption, all this is happening before a reclear. Like, that's where I'm getting these sim values from. But a lot of this could be invalidated if we reclear mythic or heroic, and I get items that are in these slots. And I think that's maybe possible that like a lot of people probably have okay hands and gloves and rings, which are maybe something that I need. Maybe not rings, but hands and gloves. A lot of people might have good male ones already, and there's not that many male wearers in a raid, so it's maybe actually pretty likely that I see those from a mythic reclear and invalidate a lot of the value from my great vault. But again, this is also kind of dependent on the composition of the raid, things like that. So, that's a lot of modeling and assumptions to say that the marginal value of a Mythic Plus box is something like 50 DPS and a couple hundred HP. Maybe like 200, 250 HP. Some of that coming from avoidance, some of that coming from real HP, and something like 50 DPS. Okay, those numbers are pretty small. So what does this all mean? Well, let's write these down for posterity. So I'm saying, whoops, you get to see my Twitch, what I was watching on Twitch. But I'm saying that going from 4 to 8 keys in this particular circumstance is gaining me something like 50 DPS and 250 HP in expectation on the margin. This doesn't mean that like by doing this box, I gain exactly that amount of HP, but it's saying like from the average outcomes based on how likely they are, this is sort of the approximate gain from doing this key. But I think the number that you care about isn't actually the expected DPS that you gain from this marginal slot, but really like the expected progression time that you save from this marginal vault slot. This is something we talk about a lot, but like if a boss has really high mechanical execution checks and not much of a throughput check, then having more damage isn't going to save you. If a boss has a really high throughput check, but is relatively simple, like if you're fighting Magmarax in a world where Magmarax is a 200 pull boss and not a 20 pull boss, then like the thing that you care about is having a lot of throughput, and having lots of throughput saves you lots of progression time in a way that doing mechanics better can't, because the whole thing is just like hitting your buttons exactly correctly to survive. All that is to say, it's not clear what the function from sort of raid throughput gained to progression time saved is. Now we're on Tindral, and I would guess that on Tindral, sort of there's something like 5 to 10 basis points of raid throughput that we're going to get from marginal vault slots. When these vault slots take people an hour or two to unlock to do those 4 keys, is just going to save a lot less progression time than an hour of raid. I say 10 bips of throughput because I may be slightly more geared than the average player in our raid. I've maybe done more keys. Other people have like valuable trinkets to get. Maybe they have weapons to get, not just off pieces. So maybe my like 3 or 4 basis points of DPS is a relatively small gain, and some people are going to see something like 10 to 15 basis points from that marginal slot. Regardless, the point is, if everyone in the raid is going to spend 2 hours farming keys to gain a few basis points in raid throughput in expectation, well, why don't we just spend 2 hours in Tindral? Like, Tindral is maybe a, 30 to 50 hour boss or something. Like, 500 pulls, you pull 10 times an hour or something. 50 hours doesn't seem crazy. We could just knock out 2 hours of progression together by just raiding more. So why do we need to do keys? It just doesn't make that much sense. This is sort of what you see in like the Race to World First. Sort of, there's a point in the Race to World First where the characters could get upgrades from going into Mythic Plus. Maybe even on the last boss, like in a 1 week race that doesn't go to a second reset, people are under geared relatively to what Mythic Plus offers. They could just go into keys and get more good gear. But if they're on the last boss, like they should just keep progressing that boss, because their DPS isn't going to help them that much more than like having more reps and having more practice on this complicated boss. Same thing I think applies here. We're like, we can all spend a couple hours to get a very marginal amount of throughput. Here I use marginal to mean like a very small amount. But we could also just raid more. And I think that like makes us clear the raid faster than spending all this time out of the raid farming. But even if you can't raid more because of people's schedules, or people don't want to spend that much time in the raid, by having everyone do some number of keys, you're sort of saying that everyone should spend some amount of time out of raid preparing for the raid. And there are other things you could do. You could do log review. You could look at kill videos. You could review your own VODs. You could practice on a target dummy or something. I don't even say that facetiously. Like, if you're a Hall of Fame raider and you're not consistently nuking the DPS meters, there's probably lots of small optimizations in your rotation, in your talent build, in your positioning, in your decision making, that are costing you hundreds or thousands of DPS on pulls. And you can just spend time practicing those things instead of doing keys. I don't think doing weekly 20s is particularly good practice, especially with how easy they are this season. Like, you can just turn your brain off and like watch Netflix and do them. So if you're not actively trying to stay engaged, you're not getting really valuable active practice from those. You could just go out and like learn more about the fight itself, practice your class a little more, something that saves more progression time than this very tiny amount of marginal raid throughput. I think this is actually probably true for your like second, third, and fourth keys. But you have to do at least 2 for aspect crests. Or sorry, I think this is probably true for your like third and fourth keys. But you maybe have to do 2 for aspect crests. Like, you get 70 from re-clearing through Smolderon, and you need 90 for the week. You got to do at least 2 keys to get those extra 20. I think someone could make the argument that those extra 20 aren't actually worth it either. Just in terms of like the time you're investing. But I think that's much more contingent on really specific factors and assumptions people make. But all this, I think, is ignoring that the shape of this function, from like total raid throughput gained to raid progression time saved, is really dependent on where you are in progression and like the time value of throughput. I sort of touched on this with the Magmarex example, but that doesn't extend it further out in time. That's just looking at like where you are at, which boss you're on right now. And sort of looking forward for us, we're pulling Tindral and getting into the end of P1, start of P2, but not much deeper than that. Like, I think we've only seen 1 set of seeds so far. That means that we have hundreds of pulls of Tindral to go, and hundreds of pulls of Tindral where the thing that's going to be wiping us is the execution checks of the fight. Things like getting everyone to their seeds, getting everyone to the dispel positions, not dying to fire beams, which overkill you by 300%. Getting all the feathers and the orbs to get the roots broken. Those kinds of really like pass-fail execution checks where having throughput doesn't change the outcome at all. So if we have another like week or 2 of progression where 90% of the wipes that will happen to us are going to be caused by execution checks and not throughput failures, then having a little more DPS this week is not at all relevant for our future progression. It's just like we have the ability as humans to make predictions about the future with relative accuracy. It's like why humans are able to rule the world and not dolphins or something, or not, chickens. Maybe we want to pick something else with opposable thumbs, like some primate, but we're smarter than all of them. We're able to predict more, and we should sort of leverage that capability. I think this sort of effect that we're discussing also matters for the sort of optionality of the vault. So one thing I talked about earlier is like a thing that could happen in my vault is I could save some crests by getting an upgrade that is 43 and lets me upgrade another item. That's cool for this week. But we already said like this week, DPS doesn't matter that much. And the week after that, I'm going to get another chance to see another vault. And so not only is like DPS less relevant for the bosses that we're doing, which are more execution heavy than throughput heavy, but also the longer we expect to raid in these execution heavy regimes, the more vaults we're going to see. So if we're on Tindral for another 2 or 3 resets, like you're going to see more and more vaults, and you're going to accumulate more and more extra crests that have to be used somewhere. So it's more and more likely that the crests that you save this week from some ring upgrade that you saw in your vault are like actually invalidated by just having extra crests later. To put it another way, if we kill Tindral or if we kill Fyrak and I have 60 extra aspects crests, then it doesn't really matter that I saved 30 crests this week from a vault upgrade because I didn't use all of them. Like, it only matters saving things when you needed to use them at a later date. If you play Skyrim and you end the game with all kinds of consumable, health potions in your inventory, it's like saving them didn't help you at all. You just didn't use these items, and so they provided no benefit to your success. Same thing goes here. If I save some aspect crests now, and then I don't ever use them in the progression by the end of the tier, it's like this was just useless time spent that didn't accomplish anything. In other words, we have to discount the DPS gains not only by the throughput checks of the bosses that we're doing, but by the expected time that we are going to spend on those bosses. And so there's like two factors of discounting here that make the vault really, really less valuable than it appears. Anyway, that's been a big tirade to say, if you're gaining 50 DPS and 250 HP by doing 4 keys, and this 50 DPS, 250 HP is even less valuable than it appears because you're on a boss that doesn't really care about your throughput and mostly cares about you doing pass-fail mechanics correctly, then maybe you shouldn't do those 4 keys and you should do something else with your life. That's it. Thanks for listening.